haunted by my own existence. I am a human being. But in the great scheme of things, in the vast cosmos, what are human beings? Perhaps accidental and incidental without point or purpose. Perhaps goal-directed and central with a cosmic point or purpose. If incidental, can we make our own point? If central, can we align with the cosmic point? While it is not for me to answer these big questions, perhaps I can address my opening, smaller question: what are human beings? What am I individually as a human being? What are we collectively as the human race? Both questions reflect a common theme: human nature. Is there even such a thing as human nature? Special traits that all human beings have in common? If so, how does human nature differ from the natures of other animals? Is human nature unique? If so, what makes it so? What is human nature? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. How to explore human nature, the nature of Homo sapiens. How to get an overarching perspective. Biology and psychology seem the default sciences, but how to integrate all the information, see a big picture. How to see the forest of meaning from the trees of data. I wonder if philosophy can help, a philosophical perspective, a way of thinking that applies analytic rigor to the problems and puzzles in biology and psychology. In other words, visualize human nature through the lens of philosophy of biology and philosophy of mind. I begin with a philosopher of biology, an expert on the philosophy of race, Quayshawn Spencer. Quayshawn, as a philosopher of biology, how do you look at human nature?
I'm a fan of the heavily genealogical approach. These are the phylogeneticists. And the way that they understand a species is a phylogenetic species where you have a monophyletic group of organisms. This is an ancestor and all of its descendants. It's like a very tight family of organisms that is either sustained by a deep sort of divergence or a isolating mechanism. So I would define Homo sapiens as the phylogenetic species that's immediately descended from Homo ergaster and sister Homo neanderthalensis. Now, something that falls out of this way of thinking about humans is you're adopting something called relational essentialism. This is a paradigm of thinking about unary properties as being the essential properties of species. So these are just sort of properties that you have all by yourself versus relational properties that you have in relation to something else. And if you make all your essential properties relational properties, you can solve a lot of problems in taxonomic classification. And so this seems to be the right way forward. But then what you get rid of is thinking about humans as some sort of instantiating certain stereotypical traits, like speaking a language or being bipedal or having large brains. From the phylogenetic point of view, all those traits can fall off, and you still have the monophyletic group.
And that's because you're doing it in a relational way?
Yep, in relation to the ancestors and your siblings.
But what are the implications of that?
Well, the implications are that you start to think about the properties that we stereotypically associate with humans, like we're intelligent creatures, we're linguistic creatures, as being contingent properties, not necessary properties. These are properties that might be universal at a certain point in history of our species, but they could not obtain in our species.
And still maintain.
And you can still be the same species.
So there's no biological essentialism in the species, it's all relational?
It's just a different way of thinking about essence. So I'm thinking about essence as the thing that makes you what you are, your identity conditions, not anything thicker than that. They could just be relational properties.
And so what then is the distinction between humans and other animals?
It's counterintuitive, but there aren't any essential different traits. Species can survive their traits from this phylogenetic perspective. This is part of the phylogenetic turn in conceptual thinking. You're on probation.
Quayshawn has human beings, like all animals, as phylogenetic species, defined genealogically by connections with ancestors and siblings. He takes a deflationary view of human nature. There are no essential human traits, in that all species can survive the loss of any of their traits. Is this gradualist, non-exceptionalist approach to human nature a good starting place to explore further? I take it further with a strong reductionist, a philosopher of biology with interests in philosophy of mind, Alex Rosenberg.
What Darwin taught was that everything comes in this nice bell-shaped curve. Like height is the obvious example, right? The medium height is what? Among Dutch people, it's 6'2". Among us, it's 5'11" or something like that. So if every interesting biological trait, hardwired trait, comes in a nice bell-shaped curve, then what we can say about human nature is only that it's a matter of what the median and the standard deviations are, and that the extreme ends, tails, are always going to be with us as a result of the constant recombination of the genome, even of the individual organisms that are very close to the mean. And therefore, the idea that there's a human nature in the sense of a set of traits common and peculiar to us seems to be a non-starter from the Darwinian biological point of view.
Since there isn't human nature, humans are not unique.
Right, and so if you describe traits for other primates, okay, our distribution is going to be quite distinctive compared to others, but is it going to be in the same ballpark? Roughly. There are some traits, of course, that humans have that other primates don't. Language and the artifacts that language has enabled us to produce. So it's certainly clear as a way of distinguishing us from other species, there isn't much controversy or difficulty, okay? But that difference is, again, going to be a matter of degree, maybe very substantial degree, but still always a matter of degree.
And there's no gap.
No, I don't think there's a gap. There are some differences that are so striking that they demand explanation. Yeah. So, for example, we humans, even from the earliest ages, have the property of cooperative intentionality. You give a little baby a ball, right? You throw it at the baby, and the baby will throw it back to you, right? Because the baby already has a theory of mind in operation, treating you as an agent with whom they can interact, okay? Mm-hmm. Whereas chimpanzees, even bonobos, okay, they can't seem to do that. And that looks like at least a particular, relatively low-level, simple behavioral trait on which a lot of human differences with other organisms, other primates have been built, that we need to find out the basis of. And if science eventually teaches us that the basis is some kind of step function change, like Chomsky's recursion, okay, then we're going to have perhaps another basis for that distinction between us and other species. So there's something where it looks like the beginning of something that, if it isn't human uniqueness, is at least a big enough difference to be more than merely a gradual increase.
By defining all animal traits as bell-shaped distribution curves, Alex has human nature on the same spectrum with the natures of other animals. This resonates with his reductionism and reinforces the view that human nature is not exceptional. But then he hesitates on language. So could human nature be somehow special? Are there other philosophers of biology, while still in every way physicalists, who see human nature as distinct? I ask a philosopher who was an evolutionary biologist, Massimo Pigliucci.
It's interesting that when I talk to my colleagues in philosophy, they really have a sort of a knee-jerk reaction against the whole idea of human nature. And I think the reason for that is the idea of human nature is often being linked to genetic determinism, biological determinism. And that position is not very popular in philosophy these days. And when I talk to my biology colleagues, they tend to emphasize the continuity between human beings and other animals. My position, I guess, is very different. I think there is a human nature, and we're damn different from everything else on the planet. Now, are we different in the sense that we have something unique, that it's us and only us have? Probably not, with the possible exception of language, but I don't think we need something unique. Sometimes a quantitative difference is large enough that for all effective purposes it becomes qualitative. We are certainly quantitatively smarter than, say, other mammals, other social mammals. But that quantity is so large that we went to the moon and they didn't. The same goes with the use of tools.
Animals use too.
Well, yeah, but look at the tools. You're not going to get much done with the tools that a typical chimpanzee uses. Some animals have culture. True, but again, that kind of culture is nothing compared to what we're talking in terms of humanity. Now, what about human nature? Every animal, I think, or plant or living organism has a nature in the sense that there are things that I can tell about that species that are characteristic of that species. You get a cactus, for instance, and there is a cactus nature. Among other things, it means that even though it's a plant, it doesn't need a lot of water because otherwise you kill it. Right, and so therefore cactus nature is different from the nature of another plant. The same goes for human beings. We do have a nature, meaning that there are certain things that are species typical or species normal that are different from, let's say, the equivalent traits in a bonobos or in a chimpanzees. And I don't think there is anything magical about that. The ancient Stoics got it close to right. They focused on two aspects of human nature that they thought were particularly informative. One is our ability to reason. Again, other animals possibly have that ability, but we have it to a much larger extent. And we are highly social. Again, there are other social animals, of course, but human societies are far more structured than anything else on the planet.
Massimo comes down hard that there is a human nature and that we are different from other animals. If so, how so? Certainly he invokes no spooky stuff, no spirits, no souls. How then did human uniqueness happen? I put the question to a philosopher of human evolution and the natural history of mind, Rachell Powell.
The most obvious sort of thing about human beings compared to, say, other primates is that they're extraordinarily cooperative, whereas other primates can be quite hierarchical. Humans have these deep egalitarian sentiments, so they have these incredible abilities to share. How does that help explain human success? And so a lot of people think that it's human morality that really has underpinned human ultra cooperation, and that's what's really giving us the best explanation of human success. But here's where I would want to kind of push back against that. So if you're thinking about why humans are so successful and so ultra cooperative compared to other primates or other vertebrates, you're going to be talking about the evolution of moral capacities that allowed humans to cooperate in various ways, to cooperatively forage, to cooperatively brood. But here's the interesting thing. Those same ultra-cooperative capacities, though lacking in all of the vertebrates, are present in the social insects and have been around for a lot longer than they have for human beings. I mean, humans evolved these capacities in the last eye blink. Social insects have evolved them, for millions of years, and they are equally profoundly impactful on global ecosystems as human beings are.
So what you're saying is that cooperation is necessary but not sufficient.
Well, so we know that cooperation is important for explaining success. But here's another example in the social insects where you have these ultra cooperative capacities that don't require the kind of higher cognitive moral capacities that we normally think were critical for human beings. And so what I'm interested in is the ways in which human societies and social insect societies have converged on a kind of social normative capacities that then underpin these ultra cooperative functions.
To explain human nature, Rachell combines the evolution of social cooperation, exemplified by social insects, energized by the human capacity for language and cultural accumulation. The evolutionary theories are all well and good, but is there evidence in the archaeological record? I ask a philosopher of biology and mind who has a second doctorate in archaeology and art, Helen to Cruz.
Human evolution tells us something about ourselves. We want to learn more about ourselves, and that's why we look in the past and we project our own ideas onto the past, right? So you had, like, in the 50s, 60s, you had the idea of man the hunter, or you had the idea of sort of like murderous apes. Then you had the idea about, like, peaceful humans who lived in communities. So you have to be always cognizant that looking at the archaeological evidence, that we sort of read into it in part what we find interesting about ourselves or how we conceive of ourselves. Nonetheless, I do think that we can learn so much from paleoanthropology that it really tells us something about who we are today. The idea is briefly this, that at some point, a spectacular change occurred in human evolution. And all of a sudden, we all started talking and making art and making complex tools. But I think that a lot of the work of African Middle Stone Age cultures, and particularly also very recently in Indonesia and Sulawesi, have sort of overturned this idea of cultural modernity into something more gradual. So initially there was the idea that even though humans were anatomically modern, at least 100,000 years, and now maybe as much as 300,000 years, that cultural modernity was much more recent. And so the evidence for that was like the great rock art in France and the sculptures in southwest Germany. But now we see a sort of more gradual picture. So anatomically modern humans have gone out of Africa a lot earlier than we thought. And they also started doing these things, making art, making beads, for example. You have beads in Morocco and in the Levant of about 135,000. There's also all this recent work on Neanderthals to establish that, yes, Neanderthals could do this stuff before they met anatomically modern Homo sapiens. So there is the very concept of a creative explosion has to be sort of nuanced. There is a more gradual picture and that doesn't make it any less spectacular. I think that even so, it's still interesting to ask, like, why did Homo sapiens make art? When we then look at what really matters, when we want to see what is really and truly human, we say it's art.
Helen calls upon paleoanthropology, especially with respect to ancient art, to evidence the unique evolution of human nature. Now, assuming that human nature is distinct, what is its scope? I put the question to a philosopher of biology who applies systems theory to evolution and biological development, Paul Griffiths.
Human nature is such a problematic idea. It's got this long history of being used to distinguish between human beings who are really human, who are the correct expression of our real nature, and other inferior or different people. But we can't do without a notion of human nature if we believe in the possibility of learning about human beings. So we have all these human sciences. We have economics, sociology, anthropology, and they all purport to tell us something about what human beings are like. And they seem to do that with some degree of success. So it must be the case that there's things we can say about human beings that are reasonably true enough of the time that they're really worth knowing. And so my long-term collaborator, Carola Stotz, and I like to call that the descriptive sense of human nature. Descriptively, human nature is just what people are like. And what are they like? Well, they're diverse, but they're diverse with some regularities and patterns and limits. And so that's a very unproblematic notion of human nature. You might even wonder whether it's worth calling it human nature. Because the other thing that people have traditionally wanted from human nature is an explanation of why human beings are the way that they are. So your nature is something inside you. It's why you're human rather than a dog or a cat, because you've got human nature and they've got dog nature and cat nature. And there's this idea that you can more or less perfectly express human nature. And if you don't get it right, you're kind of a bad representation of what you really are. You're somehow something wrong with you. So we think it's possible to have a kind of underlying explanatory notion of human nature like that without any of those problematic overturns. So what Stotz and I argued is that we will understand human nature when we understand human developmental biology and human developmental psychology. Then that will explain both the things that are broad generalizations about people. It will explain the diversity of people, and it'll help us understand why that is. So for us, a theory of human nature is a theory of human development, and it embraces both what's distinctive about human beings and how diverse human beings are and how they're different at different times in different places. If there's one thing that's unique about human beings, it's their variation, how varied and diverse they are. And that's because of the variation and diversity of human cultures. We are continually innovating in the way that we live and the way that we bring up our offspring. And that creates a continuing change, continuing development in human diversity. Everything in biology is continuous, right? Nothing comes from nothing. But when you look at those phenomena in other species, they are very marginal, whereas for humans, they're absolutely at the heart of understanding us as a species.
And what's the potential cause of that in humans?
It's cultural transmission.
To Paul, we will understand human nature only when we understand human development, biological and psychological. In other words, we cannot understand human nature statically. We can understand human nature only dynamically, developing over time. Does this mean there is some kind of special property in human development that makes us human? I ask a philosopher of science who sees evolution as pluralistic principles and where process is fundamental, John Dupré.
I don't believe in there being some property which makes us human that we can somehow find has some really wonderful and special and unique importance. I do think we're a unique species, but one of the reasons I think so is I think we are uniquely plastic, which of course is to say our developmental outcomes are uniquely variable, and this is obviously at odds with the idea that we follow some developmental path determined by human nature. One of the ways in which this makes us actually unique is that it facilitates an absolutely unique division of labor in the human species. And I think it's one of the things that we know but usually forget. And I think particularly because of the way it relates to the very dominant ideologies of individualism that we've lived with. So we tend to think that, I sit there here feeling how pleased I am to have understood the nature of life so well, but of course, my ability to do so has been made possible by the fact that countless other people have provided me with food, housing, clothing, heat, transport, paper, you know, the list goes on. And I go into this because I think it diverts in a way from what is unique about the human species, which is our extraordinary ability to cooperate.
So where does that come from?
It comes from our plasticity, our ability to develop all kinds of different skills which no individual could encompass within their lifetime.
And so that plasticity came through biological evolution of the brain in some way?
Yes, I think it did. I mean, whether it was the individual, evolution of the individual, or evolution at a higher level, cultural, social evolution. But of course, the biological side of it was the gradual decrease of biological determination of our developmental outcome, the skills that we were able to obtain. I mean, clearly, if you look at the other end of the living world, at, say, insects, often what you find is very stereotyped behaviors, a very limited range of behaviors that every member of the species, more or less in the kind of genetic determinist model, sort of unfolds. We're just not like that at all. What the human uniqueness is largely about the ability to cooperate, and to cooperate by many different individuals acquiring many different skills.
I remain haunted by my own existence, trying to discern human nature to address what it means to be human. Here are some ideas. A phylogenetic approach privileges the genealogy of ancestors and siblings and denies essential human nature traits. All animal traits, including all human traits, are distributed along the same spectrum, each with its bell-shaped curve. Human nature is not a distinct kind or category. Human nature is real, and humans are unique, especially our capacity to reason and social structure. Human nature combines social cooperation with language and cultural accumulation. Ancient art provides evidence for the gradual, though no less spectacular, development of human nature. To understand human nature, one must appreciate human developmental biology, which embraces the distinctiveness and the diversity of human beings. Human uniqueness comes from the capacity to cooperate. I've been looking at human nature from the outside, a third-person perspective. What if I'd look at human nature from the inside, a first-person perspective? Would I be any less haunted? Would I be any closer to truth?
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.